Hi, we continue in Luke 16 today after Jesus has told the parable of the manager of injustice and now is offering some of his own comments on it. So as I was noting at the beginning of exploring this story, there are many issues that scholars have considered in understanding how the verses we're going to look at today from 8b to 13 fit in with the parable itself. And I was noting that in the introduction to this, as you can see here, some of these about how does this interpretation fit in and how much is from Jesus and how much is from somebody else. And as I've been exploring here, we can interpret it all as from either Jesus or from Luke, depending upon how you want to see that, as fitting perfectly together, and there's no problem as long as we recognize the pattern that's at issue. And so that's what I'm going to help us to see as we go. So part of what we're doing, as we can see here, is the explanation here in 16.8 to 13 is part of this unit that went all the way back to the beginning of the Father and the two sons. And I noted last time and the time before some of the links between those, and I won't bring that up again. So if you haven't seen that, I encourage you to go back and watch the last couple of videos around that. But there's something really important that we're going to look at about our passage here today. So we're looking at this unit right here. And it follows after that, and we can see that mammon of injustice is a phrase used twice here, and mammon 3 times, and only here. So that's important. But when we zoom in on it, we can see a structure sort of like this. And if that's confusing, let me go over it here and we can see what's going on. Because there's a series of contrasts, and the ones that have color in the background like this are contrasts within each little stanza. And I use the word stanza. It's not exactly a poem, but it sort of is like a poem, as you can see. So in the first part, children of this age are contrasted with children of light. Here, mammon of injustice is contrasted with eternal homes, and the word for eternal, aionios, here is basically the same word as age here, aionos here. It only means eternal by implication. It literally means age, aeon, like the English eon, E-O-N, means a long period of time, and eternal means time that doesn't end, or everlasting, as it's sometimes translated. But it doesn't have an inherent meaning of eternal, it has an inherent meaning of an age. So there's also a contrast across stanzas here between the children of this age and eternal homes, or homes of a long-standing age, if you will. Then there's a different contrast, and interestingly, between pistis, translated as either faithful or trustworthy. And I actually like trustworthy because faithful sounds religious to people, and trustworthy fits the environment of what we're at here, of a manager who is trustworthy to his lord or master in relation to the property that the master is owed, or a task at issue. And so that's what Jesus is contrasting here, is trustworthiness in little versus trustworthiness in much. And notice there's a double contrast here. On one hand, it's faithfulness or trustworthiness versus unjust, and that's an interesting contrast we'll look at in more detail when we go there. And the contrast this way, if you will, is a little and much. And so a whole series of contrasts here. Then following up on the faithful and trustworthy, the contrast here, and I didn't put that in the small caps because there's not a contrast with faithful and trustworthy. The contrast here is between the mammon of injustice and what is true or real. It's translated true riches down here in New RSV, but that's just wrong. It has nothing directly to do with riches. It has to do with what is true. So by implication and metaphor, we can say true wealth or true treasure, as Luke sometimes does, but it's not about riches. It's about ultimately what is true. And then it goes down one more time to make the same comparison. If you've not been faithful with the mammon of injustice, and if you've not been faithful with what belongs to another, who will give you what is yours? And the word for what is yours here, humateron, is only in one other place in Luke's Gospel, in 6:20, where it refers to the reign of God. So plainly, we can hear it that way, and we're supposed to hear it in light of what we've heard before. If you've not been faithful or trusted with what belongs to another, which is to say the imperial economy, who will give you the reign of God? In other words, if you haven't shown the ability to be trustworthy, then why would God trust you with the most important thing? And that leads to the heart of the whole matter. And notice how this is symmetrical in a little ABBA chiastic sort of way. the slave for two masters matches slave for God and Mammon here. And then the contrast, the double contrast here. Hate goes with despise across here, and love goes with devoted across there. And I didn't underline the one and the other, but obviously those match just as these match. So ultimately it comes down to that all of this, whether it's about what we call economics or what we call relationships, and notice that both are deeply invested here. It's the economics, if you will, that brings you relationships. You make friends with the mammon of injustice, and that brings you into being welcomed and receiving hospitality. So for Luke, and really for all of reality, if we look at it that way, money and economics reflects what people believe about people, not just about money, of who's entitled to their generosity or their charity or to their support and treatment as equals. And so we'll see more of that as we continue in the next parable of the rich man and Lazarus. So that's the whole summary. I think I'll just leave that up here as we go through the individual words and see what's going on. So the parable ended with Jesus saying what the master did, and now this is Jesus talking. And an interesting aspect is scholars have struggled over who the children of this age and the children of light are, and I think sometimes they're trying to be more shrewd than the text itself is. As Jerkins suggests below, he argues that, quote, the tax collectors, sinners, and others who are coming to Jesus, those rejected by the religious leaders because of what Jesus reports that Jesus says about the coming of the kingdom, are the children of this age, and that the children of light are the Pharisees, which is, he's saying that a little ironically, they see themselves as the children of light, and he takes that a little bit from the fact that at the Dead Sea Scroll text, the Qumran, the partisans of that community refer to themselves often as children of light, seeing themselves as the one who are in right relationship with God, in contrast with those who've made the alliance with Rome and have occupied Jerusalem, and hence calling for the Messiahs that the Qumran people expected, a priestly one to purify it and a royal one to take it back. So that's perhaps how Jerkin's seeing it, but I don't think we need to be that convoluted. I think the contrast that we're seeing throughout the entire unit here is between the world of empire and the world of God, which is to say the children of this age, tueonas tauton here, and it's only here in one other time that we hear this phrase, but aeon is a number of times. We'll look at that more in a minute. Are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the children of light. In other words, he's speaking to you directly to the disciples, even though we know that the Pharisees and the scribes are listening. In fact, they'll respond in verse 14 right after this. And we have no reason to think the tax collectors and sinners who had come to listen aren't still listening. So this could apply to any of those, but certainly the seemingly obvious interpretation is the children of this age represent people like the manager of injustice, someone who's caught up in the way of what we'd say the way of the world or the way of empire, and are trying to figure out how to survive from within that, in contrast with people whose realm is completely different, and that's what leads to the bottom of our section here. You're either slaving for God or you're slaving for Mammon, and we'll get to Mammon more closely in just a minute. So the issue for more is simply huper there, the normal sense of more or greater, and a shrewd phronimos, as I was noting earlier, is the connection with the chiastic parallel back here on this side with the other manager there. So we knew that phronimos can be translated as shrewd or as prudent, or as we might think of as worldly wisdom, of how to be rationally smart, if you will, in the world, how to figure out what will work. It has little to do with listening to God. The people who come to listen to Jesus are the ones who are being described here as shrewd. The one who's being described as shrewd is the manager, and there was no reference to God there. He was simply trying to figure out how to survive, and in doing that, he incidentally made everything better for everybody. And so his dealing with his generation is an inspiration. And as we'll see, the person who will embody that inspiration is Zacchaeus, and we'll see that in chapter 19. So light we've seen a number of times, and it was light to the Gentiles earlier, and we've seen it other times. I won't go back all through that. I did want to stop on the age issue, though, before I jump ahead. Notice the 3 times earlier were all positive back in the very first chapter around the celebration of what's coming. So there, it was a promise of forever. Let's go back and look at one here. He will reign over the house of Jacob forever. And all three of them in chapter 1 relate to forever. We might as well look at these ahead so we can get the whole idea. In 1830, this is a question of the rich man who walks away sad and Peter's objection. And Jesus says, there's no one who will not get back much more in this age and the age to come. There it is again, aeonion, eternal life. And I think this contrast here is really suggesting the same contrast I'm making here between the children of this age and the children of light. And it fits what we see here with the question of eternal homes, that in the parable, the manager said they'll welcome me into their homes, oikia, actual physical houses here. And here it's something else. Here, in fact, we'll see it's tents. So then Jesus says, I tell you, and ostensibly disciples, but we recognize that could be anybody. Bednarz, who's trying to find humor in these various things, her articles about humor, sees this as a tongue-in-cheek dictum about the idiocy of making friends with unjust wealth. But I completely disagree here. Rather than being idiocy, I think it's precisely what Jesus is calling for, which is to say that if you can transform money or other kinds of wealth. In the story, there wasn't money, there were simply large amounts of oil or large amounts of wheat. If you can transform imperial money, which is to say money that's been gained by injustice and exploitation, into authentic friendships, why not do that? It's not a matter of buying friends. Obviously, anybody who becomes your friend by buying is not really a friend. They're just there for the money. But if you can establish authentic relationships of trust and love by using the dishonest money while it's still there, why not do it? And as my note below here from Herzog says, it's worth listening to the whole thing. The steward acted as if the distinction between thine and mine no longer existed. This was nothing less than a prophecy of the post-Pentecostal course of the early church, whose members held all things in common. The twisted machinations of debtors and desperate scheming of the steward led to a lowering of debt to which the master, for whatever reason, consented. The result was a glimpse for the debtors of another order, one in which forgiveness of debt would be more than a petition and a prayer, referring back, of course, to the Lord's Prayer in Luke 11. And, of course, what it's ultimately referring to is back to the Jubilee proclamation that Jesus made in his opening sermon in Nazareth back in chapter 4, to bring good news to the poor. And good news to the poor isn't simply their interest they owe is a little less, but that there's Jubilee, that they get the fresh start that has been promised by God in the Scriptures all the way back to Leviticus, and also expressed in Deuteronomy and Isaiah. So a long tradition of that promise. Now Jesus wants to make it real. So he says, make friends for yourselves, and we see friends in other places, and it's worth looking at friends, because friends has a number of connotations. As we see at the end, there's the political connotation of Herod and Pilate becoming friends, which is to say, having a common enemy makes them friends. They had been enemies, and now they're friends, bonding over trying to get rid of Jesus. And we've seen other examples of elite friends in the sense of friends in a sense of balanced reciprocity. I do for you and you do for me. But what we're hearing here is something else. What we're hearing here are people you can rely on, people who will welcome you, even though you have friends who will betray you, as we'll hear. And we already heard, don't invite your friends and rich neighbors when you're having a banquet. So mixed elements about friends, but here Jesus is telling to make friends through the mammon of injustice. Marianne Beavis suggests make friends for yourself outside the mammon of injustice, taking ek2 as outside. So she renders it as stay away from unjust people like the steward and his master now, so you will belong among the saints on Judgment Day. But Burkitt rejects that along with other similar retranslations, and he says all these proposals are unpersuasive attempts to avoid the most obvious meaning of the statement. And he goes on to offer this. The parable exhorts its audience to make friends by means of the mammon of unrighteousness, that is, by means of money, seen as a necessary evil of the present unrighteous age. This exhortation implies that the audience had access to such money, which is underscoring the point I've been making that the Pharisees stand in for Luke's elite Roman audience, for whom the whole gospel is written. So writing to them, he's saying, take the wealth that you're entitled to, perhaps that you've already inherited, or that your situation in life has all around you, and then you can make authentic friends out of that. So when that money is gone, And we'll see later in the apocalyptic images that, of course, empires always fall, so we can count on that wealth being gone, not just your personal wealth, but the entire empire being gone, much like the fall of Babylon scene in Revelation 17 and 18 shows it gone. And the they is unclear, but they may welcome you, just as in the parable he wanted to be welcomed into homes, into eternal tents, skenas. And we only see tent in the only other place we see tents is in the Transfiguration story, where they plainly aren't eternal tents. That's what Peter wants them to be. He wants to stay there forever, but Jesus wakes them up and says they can't do that. Bednar's, again trying to find humor here, says, one does not expect the friends of wealth to end up in tents. The barb suggests robbers on the run, living in tents for the rest of their lives. But I think the point down here from Giambroni is on point here. The singular phrase eternal tents has puzzled interpreters who fail to see the hospitality theme unifying Luke 16. Abraham was known as a sojourner who dwelt in tents, whose memorable act of welcome in Genesis 18 repeatedly mentions his tent as the setting. And of course, in the next parable, Abraham will be the focus of it with Lazarus comfortably in his bosom. So again, scholars who understand how the pieces fit can help us make sense of the entire thing. So let's scroll down just a little bit more so we can see the rest of our passage here. So notice the contrast that shift here. It went from make friends by the children of justice, the mammon of injustice, to the question of faithfulness. And pistos, as Vincent suggests, reliable, but it has a much wider range than church people usually think of it as, faithful in the sense of a creed or church doctrines. It can also mean confidence or trust with anything that makes someone true to a relationship of whatever kind. So whoever's faithful in a little, and the contrast of little and great is one that many scholars have noted was very common in the Greco-Roman world as well as in the biblical world. So that's not a small thing to argue from the small to the greater. So whoever is faithful in small things is also faithful in large things, and whoever is unjust. And I just want to underscore, there's no basis whatsoever for translating adikos as dishonest. If we look at the lexicons, and I almost did that, but I didn't want to waste our time, all the lexicons simply say unjust or unjust in various words, but it's not dishonest. It doesn't have to do with whether one's speaking or not. It has to do with the arrangements of things. So dishonest is just flat wrong. It should be whoever is unjust in little is unjust in much. And notice the parallel shifts from faithfulness to the question of mammon versus the true wealth or the true things, as we'll see. So notice this connects with 12:33, which preceded the other manager parable. Sell your possessions, give alms, make purses for yourselves that do not wear out, unfailing treasure in heaven. So we see the parallel there. So if you've not been faithful with the mammon of injustice, who will entrust to you the true thing? And we'll see how this is connected in the next verse with the reign of God. And that's the one true thing. Alethenon here, the true thing or the real thing. So let's see how this fits together, because plainly these two fit together into one notice. So notice how this is exactly parallel. And if you've not been faithful and trustworthy with what belongs to another, alatrios here, with the implication of otherness, but also foreignness. It's the word for a foreign language. Who will give you what is yours? Humateron, and it's worth going back here to see 6:20, because it might be unclear from the right side of the screen. Then he looked up and said to the disciples, "Blessed are you who are poor. Yours is the kingdom of God." Using the same term here for yours that we see here, the only other time, humateron. So what is your own is the kingdom of God. And so what is true and what is your own are both the reign of God, and that's contrasted with the mammon of injustice and what belongs to another. So, in other words, if you can't work yourselves out of the imperial economy, how do you expect God to welcome you into the reign of God? And we'll see after the Pharisees ridicule him, put their nose up at him, we'll see Jesus turn exactly to that point in the verses that follow, as we can see here in what follows down here about the question of the reign of God. And so finally in our passage for today, And the translation here is really not helpful. It's almost exactly backwards. Here, oiketas, house servant, oika continuing the oikonomos or oikoios theme that we've been seeing. This is very close to what we saw earlier in the parable, but not quite. So, but here it is slave for, and the irony is the New Revised Standard often translates doulos, which means slave, as servant, and here a word that means to slave as serve, but it's to slave for. So no servant, no house servant can slave for two lords or two masters. As Marshall notes, a slave might work for two or more persons in partnership or for two different masters, but not really. I mean, that could happen and if they share, but if you get conflicting views, we know, conflicting demands, we know what happens. And there's no slave here at all. So one will either hate the one and love the other. And we've looked both in the Sermon on the Plain and elsewhere at how hate in this context does not mean dislike or be angry at. It means reject completely. So hate as missio here and love as agapisai have to do with what's completely received or completely rejected. It doesn't necessarily have to have an emotional element. So we'll either completely reject one and completely embrace or be loyal to, hence pistis, the other, or be devoted to, or literally cling to. It's only in its parallel in Matthew 6:24, and I didn't highlight the Matthew 6:24 because it's identical. There are no differences at all, and it's in the Sermon on the Mount, so it's a completely different context. But Matthew does have this identical verse in a different context, and that word is only in both places in the Gospels. So they plainly got it from somewhere else and are each using it for their own purpose. So, or cling to one and kataphronesai, which is to say to push away from the other. So similar things that are highlighted by the double comparison. You cannot slave for God and Mammon. And it's again slave for here. And I want to make clear, it's not that it's difficult. This is not a matter of the camel going through the eye of a needle, which is also impossible. We'll get there in chapter 18. Jesus says flatly, you cannot do it. It's not that it's difficult. It's not that you can do it some of the time. You can't do it. And that's what will lead the Pharisees to put their nose up at him, as we'll see next time. So I hope you can hear how what all this explanation does is make perfect sense of the parable and how they interpret each other. Understanding this helps us understand the parable. Understanding the parable helps us understand this. And we'll see what he has to say to the Pharisees as stand-ins for his audience in our next video. See you then for that. Bye.